William Knox DRC was born in England, but migrated to Queensland, Australia with his family. He made his fortune through the Mount Morgan gold mine. He went back to England later on and started engaging in many types of investments. Antoine Khan, a senior customs administrator, bought the rights for oil exploration in Iran from a local company. He was struggling to find investors, but eventually caught DRC's interest. After a successful geological survey, DRC bought the concessions from Antoine Khan. In 1901, the agreement was finalized during the rule of Muzaffaruddin Shah. Monopoly over the extraction and refining of oil was handed over for 60 years. 5 provinces along the border of Russia were excluded by a later clause. A Russian company had acquired the rights to this area under a vague concession signed in 1896. In exchange for this contract, DRC agreed to pay a cash sum of £20,000 and £20,000 of shares in the company working under this agreement. Instead of cash, 30,000 shares were given when the first company was established. 16% of the net annual profits were also part of the deal. Oil in a commercially viable quantity was discovered at Masjid Suleiman in 1908. What complicated the matter was that the area was occupied by Bakhtiyari tribe, who tended to operate without much government intervention. Their share was 3% of the profits from oil and £30,000 per year. In 1909, the efforts took the shape of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, with a complex intermingling of Bakhtiyari Oil Company, Concession Syndicate, and Burma Oil Company. The same year, area of Abadan was selected as the site for refinery. In return, company promised rental payments, as well as a guarantee that they will prevent Iranian government from interfering with the tribal rule. Now, the company was also meshed into the local politics. The British Empire had gathered many resources in its colonial expansion, but oil was not one of them. Winston Churchill was appointed as the head of Navy in 1911. A commission was set up, headed by Sir John Fisher, in 1912, with the task of converting British Navy from coal to oil. Now, the British government was looking for a reliable supply of oil. Hitherto, we have been in a position to make our own terms, and we have bought it from year to year, month to month, according to the strictest rules of financial correctitude, in what might, without a stretch of imagination, be called open market. These days are done. The kind of oil we prefer is no longer the kind it suits refiners to make and which it pays them best to make. The open market is becoming an open mockery. Our stake in oil-burning ships is becoming so important that we must have the certainty of being able to buy a steady supply of oil at a steady price. The company was unable to turn a profit, so it welcomed the capital from British government, who from 1914 had the major share, along with the power to select 2 board of directors, insisting, however, that the government will not meddle with the inner workings of the company. Soon afterwards, World War I started. Over time, difficulties arose in this arrangement, and things began to sour. The Abadan refinery stopped functioning in 1915, when Bakhtiyari Khans with foreign involvement severed the oil pipeline. Iranian government was held liable for the damage, and royalty payments were stopped, where none had been made in the first place. Conflicts continued to grow from here. Over time, the operation in Iran grew to a size comparable to other giants. This was good news for the British government. They enjoyed money from taxes paid by APOC and a boost to foreign exchange. The British government used oil from Iran to meet the needs of the Navy. Profits from Iran allowed APOC to invest in petroleum industry across the globe. The size of the company meant that they also employed the largest number of people in Iran. Companies' attitude towards their employees and Iranian government would lead to a plethora of problems. Out of all the issues, profit sharing and companies' treatment towards its employees were the most prominent. The ambiguous nature of the contract laid the foundation for conflict. Iranians claimed that royalties must be paid for all companies under the concession, regardless of geographical location, while the company insisted payments will only be made for enterprise working in Iran. The term net profits was also nebulous. Net profits are usually calculated after expenses are subtracted from their revenue. This can include taxes, business expenses, interest on loans, and various other payments. Iranians were unable to verify what they were getting was the correct amount, as the books were kept hidden from them. One such example is company deducting money and making contributions to a fund, thus reducing Iran's royalty share. Further, company was paying British taxes and deducting money for expenses before making payments to Iran. Profits from Iran were being used to fuel company's expansion abroad, while Iranians wouldn't receive a share from this. The company also set up its subsidiaries in such a way as to limit the payments made to Iran. The royalties were also susceptible to the fluctuations of British pound. British Navy received fuel at reduced price unknown to Iranians, while they had to buy the resource from their own country at global price. The company's treatment towards its workers was poor as well. Only a small minority of Iranians were promoted to senior positions. Temporary contracts were given to Arab tribes. An immigrant workforce was used from India and Palestine instead of hiring Persian speakers. Amenities and housing were based on the grade of the employee. This led to a condition where people were forced to live in makeshift housing. To top it all off, the company operated like a colonial entity. Locals were seen as something lesser than foreign employees, who could not understand reason in comparison to their British counterparts. In 1925, Reza Shah came to power and started the reign of Pahlavi dynasty with the support of the British and Sayyid Zia. Reza Shah then in 1932 cancelled the DRC concession. Iranians made the argument that on part of Iran, there was no obligation to honor a contract signed under the previous ruler. This action was celebrated with fireworks and outpouring in the streets. There were a number of reasons that motivated this action, such as dispute over royalties, say in companies' operations, and lack of skills training for Iranians. The new agreement was signed in 1933, extending this arrangement for 32 years. Now, royalties were increased to 20%, and for every ton of oil, 4 shillings would be paid. For Iranians, the fact that Shah had settled on a contract that was barely more advantageous than the previous stained his image as a British puppet. Persia was changed to Iran. Anglo-Persian Oil Company became known as Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935. For consistency, I have used Iran throughout. Iranians felt a sense of anger towards the British that continued to grow over time. The issue of oil and meddling in the politics of the country were to be blamed. This problem grew further when the British, together with Soviet Union, invaded Iran in 1941, partly to protect the oil installation. During the occupation, Allies removed Reza Shah and appointed his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. Further, the occupation meant British involvement in the routine operations of the country. Iranians blamed the British for wartime crisis and harbored more anger towards them than the Soviet Union. However, there was a desire for a nation free from foreign influences, regardless. Mossadegh came from a family that served as administrators for Qajar dynasty. He studied law and political science in Europe. After returning from Europe, he began teaching at a university in Tehran. During this period, his writing focused on politics, and he became known for advocating reform. Reputed as being honest to his job, Mossadegh served in few government positions. He was first arrested, then banished to Ahmedabad for vague reasons during Reza Shah's rule. After Mossadegh was set free, he was able to win important seats in Tehran in the Majlis of 1925. A surprising development occurred in 1944 when an oil concession was demanded by the Soviet Union. This came as a response when it became public that attempts were being made by Western oil companies to gain a concession of their own. Regions bordering the Soviet Union were being discussed as the potential areas for the concession. This caused in Iran discussions about a path forward. In response, Iranians proposed to only sign a deal after Soviet troops withdrew from the territory they had occupied. Qawam al-Sultaneh was the prime minister at the time. Even though he was a capable politician, he was reputed to engage in closed-door deals. Qawam went to Moscow to have a discussion and negotiated troop withdrawal. The Soviet troops would leave Iranian territory. In return, when the next Majlis would assemble, Qawam needed to present the Soviet oil proposal. Both British and Americans did their best to prevent this deal by steering Iran away from the Soviets. The consequences of this approach were not appreciated at the time. The company's treatment towards its employees often led to general strikes. Such a strike happened in 1946 when the company decided to remove pay for Friday, considered a day of blessing and rest for Muslims. The Communist Two-Day Party had been making secret cells. They had grown to where 75% of the workforce was part of the two-day unions. The demand for the strike included limit to work hours, equitable pay, better housing, vacation days, Friday pay, and a commitment to upholding of the national labor standards. The turnout totaled 65,000, with mass participation of refinery workers, as well as service workers like drivers and cooks. Warships and Indian troops were sent to protect British assets, showing as much respect for the sovereign state. Martial law and mass arrests were used to disperse the crowds. On the insistence of Iranian government, Friday pay was given and minimum wage raised. Company's antagonism towards unions remained a sore point throughout its operation. Union organizers weren't expelled by the company directly. Instead, police were given a report against the union organizers, who were arrested for a week or so. Due to missing work for that time period, company now had an excuse to fire unionists. Even though there were some improvements to work conditions over time, it was not enough. Apart from local workers, British employees had criticisms of the company's practices as well. The rejection of the Soviet deal had a domino effect. This led to reconsideration of the 1933 agreement with AIOC. Qawam began the negotiations in 1947. Later on, other prime ministers continued negotiating. Instead of accepting a 50-50 deal, the company proposed to amend the previous agreement. British taxes would be paid after giving Iran 20%. For every ton of oil exported, now the payments would be 6 shillings. The language in the contract was again vague. Even though it was becoming more like a norm to have a 50-50 deal, company declared it was out of the question. This proposal became known as the Supplementary Oil Agreement. Mosaddeq then ran for the elections in the 16th Majlis. Democratic elections and oil nationalization were the main areas Mossadegh's campaign focused on. Most of his loyal allies consisted of professionals educated in France and members of the Iran Party. Iran Party itself took inspiration from French moderate Socialist Party. In 1949, however, there was a controversy for the 16th Majlis elections. Mossadegh pointed out that ballots had been rigged. He and his supporters marched towards the Marble Palace and sat silently in the gardens as protest. After the sit-in ended, Mossadegh was made chair of a coalition called National Front. National Front consisted of many professional organizations as well as political parties. From the perspective of the coup, it's important to know a few figures that were part of the National Front. Hossein Fatemi went to France to study journalism and edited National Front's newspaper. He was known to be anti-communist, but supported the nationalization struggle. Mozaffar Baghi created the Toilers' Party. Initially part of the National Front, later on he and his party worked against Mossadegh. Baghi was a careerist and joined whomever helped him achieve his goals. Abul Qasim Mustafawi Kashani was a cleric who joined the National Front to leave later on as well. He led a group known as Mujahideen-e-Islam. He was also associated with the fanatical group Fidyan-e-Islam. Later, the archive documents describe them as, at present the Iran Party and few ambitious men such as Fatmi are only certain Mossadegh henchmen, whereas Kashani and Baghai maintained but a surface cooperation with the Prime Minister. The Communist Two-Day Party indirectly supported the National Front because it was banned from public activity. Two-Day had a large support in trade unions. Mossadegh and Two-Day were in agreement regarding the oil nationalization. Two-Day, however, denounced Mossadegh for his liberal bourgeois stance. Their position changed over time and they started to consider him a genuine leader. A committee consisting of 12 people, 6 of whom were from the National Front, Mossadegh being the chairman, were to evaluate the supplementary oil agreement. Shah at the time was looking for someone who would sponsor the bill. General Ali Razmara was such a man. The 50-50 Aramco and Saudi deal killed the legitimacy of the supplementary agreement. By now, the company had been pressured by UK and US into a 50-50 deal. Before the details of this could be discussed, Razmara was assassinated on March 7, 1951. His willingness to accept the agreement had painted him as a British agent, and he was shot by a member of Fidyan Islam. In a united decision, the supplementary agreement was dismissed by the Oil Committee after the assassination. Mossadegh then introduced to the Majlis a bill to nationalize oil. By March 14, 1951, a basic version of the nationalization bill was ratified by majority vote. By the Shah's order, the new government was led by Hussein Ala, who served as the court minister. Before he could consolidate power, something big happened. The general strike of 1951 further added momentum to the nationalization struggle. The poor conditions from earlier did not change, and the company continued its strategy of hostility towards unions and cutback of provisions. The reaction of both local government and the British were deplorable. The order to shoot into the crowd led to death and injury. With the support of Arab tribes, the company also launched an attack against Tudeh. Among the call for better conditions, striking workers also demanded oil nationalization. A more comprehensive bill was presented to the Majlis by Mossadegh. He was offered the premiership after Allah resigned. Mossadegh agreed to take the position as long as the new bill was passed. Both Majlis and the Senate accepted his proposal with an overwhelming majority. Mossadegh then began the process of selecting members of his office. He made it clear to the public that the aim of his government would be to implement the bill. After Shah's approval, a board was set up to run the company installations. The crowds on 10th June celebrated when the Iranian flag was raised upon the building of AIOC. The crowds were overjoyed with the sense that Iran was finally independent. From that point, National Iranian Oil Company took charge. The settlement of oil issue that would make both parties happy was impossible to reach. Having been deprived in the past, Iranians wanted to oversee the exploration, extraction, and export of oil. The British did not want to give up any of this. If the case was about profit, there was a chance of eventual settlement. But this was only one or the other choice. Even though US portrayed itself as an honest third party, it had much to lose. Representatives from the US side were worried about losing concessions elsewhere. Even without the most basic intelligence on Iran, two elements drove American foreign policy in the post-war Persian Gulf region: oil and the fear that possible instability might jeopardize Western access to oil. Among other factors, US was worried about its concessions worldwide. After Iran, would they also demand changes to their agreements? After nationalization bill was passed, UK and US had multiple meetings discussing the issue. Western powers decided they were willing to accept the nationalization in public. But in private, the company wanted to maintain control. When the British made any offers, they added so many conditions, rendering the idea of nationalization meaningless. When the British concluded the negotiations would yield no ground, they decided to wait Mossadegh out, considering prime ministers in Iran did not last very long. While in private they were rejecting the nationalization bill, in public they were blaming Mossadegh and Iranians as a whole for the reason that negotiations stalled. They made Mossadegh out to be an unstable man who could not see reason. In order to spread this image to the public, full force of media was used. Even when the British filed a case in the International Court of Justice, they admitted that Iran, being a sovereign country, could nationalize its industry. British made these complaints, however. Iran had cancelled a signed agreement instead of negotiating or seeking arbitration. British property was exclusively targeted, and no compensation was offered in return. The compensation they expected was profit for the duration of the concession, so about 2028 million, a sum they knew Iran could not pay. Being under such enormous debt, nationalization would have been pointless. In a conflict between a private company and a country, the court had no jurisdiction, argued Iranians. Further, a fair compensation could be paid. On the other hand, the company itself did not adhere to the agreement in the first place, such as training Iranians for technical positions and opening up the books. Iranians further contested that country was under the rule of a dictator when the 1933 agreement was signed, therefore it was invalid. A temporary ruling was issued at Hague, proposing that company operations be supervised by a board selected by both countries, which was rejected by Mosaddeq. Later on, Mosaddeq would go on to win the jurisdiction argument in the case. The British were planning a war on two fronts, militarily and economically. They found ways to limit exports to Iran, assets were put under restraints, and above all, threats to impound were made against any tankers that were found to be taking Iranian oil. By late July, the British also considered a military operation called Operation Buchanan that would involve seizing the Abadan refinery. They did not pursue the idea of military intervention due to pressure from US, as well as a possible retaliation from USSR. Unable to use military force, other means to remove Mossadegh would have to be used. Shah held a meeting in 1951 with Francis Shepherd, a British ambassador. Both agreed that Mossadegh had to be removed from power. But at this time, hope was that he could be removed using political means by the political party of Sayyid Zia. Shah did not want to take part in being the opposition, as there could be severe consequences to the crown if people sided with Mossadegh. From British side, Anne Catherine Lambton played a role in British policy. She was an Orientalist scholar who advocated for a regime change through covert means by employing Iranians who had the same enemies as the British. By January 1952, both Sayyid Zia and Shah had expressed their opinions that Mossadegh had to be replaced via a coup to British and US diplomats. When Mossadegh came back from Hague, he presented the Shah with his resignation, but by a majority vote of confidence, he was reinstated. A few days afterwards, Mossadegh was to present the Shah with his cabinet. Mossadegh, who had been advocating for a constitutional cause, argued that Ministry of War should be selected through Majlis and not appointed by the Shah, who had used military to exert control. When the Shah did not fulfill this wish, Mossadegh resigned. Qawam was his replacement. While Mossadegh backers refrained from voting, Qawam won by a small majority in the Majlis and approval of the Shah. Qawam, in order to consolidate power, wanted to close the Majlis and arrest key Mossadegh supporters like Ayatollah Kashani. There was a national uprising on the 18th with the demand to put Mossadegh back in power. Both Tudeh and Ayatollah Kashani supported the uprising. Troops had unsuccessfully attempted to stop the protests. While the uprising continued, Qawam was in communication with George Middleton, British, and Lloyd Henderson, American diplomats. They did their best to support Qawam and pressured Shah to back Qawam so he could implement his policies. By 21 July 1952, Qawam resigned due to pressure from the crowds. Only thing that public would accept was Mossadegh back in power. When Mossadegh returned to his position, he questioned Henderson on supporting Qawam. Due to British sanctions, Mossadegh had requested aid from Henderson, who now found that Congress would not approve aid to an oil-producing country. This exercise showed that Mossadegh could not be removed through political means, as the public opinion was on his side, and a coup was the only option. I explained to the president that we had recently, in an effort to save the Qawam government, considered with various departments the question of providing $26 million assistance to Iran, and recall that I had mentioned this to him at the time. We had not proceeded upon this because Qawam fell before action could be taken. In the aftermath of the event, 29 people, or according to some estimates, even more died, who were hailed as martyrs for the national cause. Retired Officers Association was a public organization of the military. Devotees of Shah was a secret organization. Both were working against Mossadegh. On 23 August, Mossadegh ordered 136 officers into retirement for their involvement in the July crisis. These people who now had something against Mossadegh became part of organizations with Zahedi as the figurehead. Soon the civilians against Mossadegh would also form a coalition with the military organizations. Zahedi had also been selected by the foreign powers as the likely replacement. A plot was uncovered by Mossadegh's government which led to severance of diplomatic ties with the British. Embassy was closed down and staff were sent out of the country. Hussein Fatmi announced that they had discovered a plot with the Rashidian family and retired General Abu Hussein Hijazi's involvement. George Middleton was acting as the foreign link via the British embassy. General Zahedi and Muzaffar Baghi, even though involved, did not face any charges due to their political standing. These quotes shed light to the thinking of US and UK governments at the time. British intelligence has reported that an organization which can handle the job exists in Iran. Foreign Office sees virtually no prospect of an oil settlement with Mossadegh, and little hope that his government will be able to prevent a communist takeover. CIA and NEA believe that the ability of a new government to maintain itself following a coup would depend on prompt availability of political and financial support from the British and United States, and early conclusion of oil agreement. The British government, however, would probably not be willing to offer anything substantially better in the way of an oil settlement than proposals it would be prepared to make Dr. Mossadegh. It would rely, therefore, on a more reasonable attitude on part of the new regime and on mobilization of moderate public opinion in Iran to induce that regime to accept these proposals. I said I understood the British government was now suggesting that our two governments should promote some sort of a coup d'etat to replace Dr. Mossadegh. Sir Christopher Steele replied that his government was by no means decided on this point, but did think it should be seriously considered and would like us to be thinking about it. In Majlis there was anti-Mossadegh coalition beginning to take shape, led by Ayatollah Kashani. Supported by Baghi and few members of the Majlis, this group represented the interest of a class who had always been pro-British. They saw their influence wane under the current government. What's more, they were also connected to the royal household and Zahedi, forming the anti-Mossadegh force. This led to public disagreement in 10th of January 1953, where Kashani and his coalition opposed the extraordinary legislative power that allowed Mossadegh to expedite the matter of oil nationalization. The crowd yet again sided with Mossadegh. Crowds gathered in his support, which led the Majlis to again side with Mossadegh via a majority vote. Now the opposition lost prestige publicly, that further solidified their position. On 14th of February, while posted in Khuzestan, 42 soldiers were killed from an attack by the Bakhtiari tribe. Queen Soraya, Ali Reza, Rashidians, Zahedi, and people from Retired Officers Association were found to be part of the plot. Shah received a message from Mossadegh on 20th February. He intended to disclose information to the public that would link the Bakhtiari attack to the court and the British. He would also resign from his position. The pressure of the situation started to get to Shah, who wanted to leave the country. General Zahedi had hope about this situation, so much so that he picked a cabinet for his future government. Kashani was updated about the situation by Allah. Easy victory could be had if Mossadegh resigned. In a surprising turn of events, Mossadegh issued an arrest warrant for Zahedi. If Shah had left and Zahedi arrested, the foreign forces would lose the public face of anti-Mossadegh activities. When the British were made aware of Shah's desire to leave, they urged Americans to stop him. Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Behbahani was a religious cleric who supported the Shah. The houses of Ayatollah Kashani and Behbahani were used as the base of operations for what was about to occur. The main messages that were spread among the gang leaders that were at these houses were that Shah had resigned, Mossadegh had taken over and must be removed. Armed with a rallying call, these gang leaders, in particular Shaban Jafri, forced shops to close. Then the shopkeepers were to make their way towards the palace and Mossadegh's residence nearby. Mustafa Kashani, son of Ayatollah Kashani, carried the message to members of parliament, stating the Shah's trip would be disastrous. Mossadegh was invited to officially bid farewell to the Shah. Shah maintained, when talking to 3 members of the parliament, that the trip did not mean his resignation. Instead, he wanted the current situation to calm down while he was away. In addition, he wanted to spend some time with the Queen. A section of influential members of the parliament met with the Shah and presented Kashani's letter. Shah changed his message this time, now asserting that trip was for medical reasons. Kashani then reached out to the public directly, as a leader emphasizing the detrimental effect Shah's departure would have and the need for people to stop him. Over time, a crowd of 1,000 to 3,000 people gathered in front of the palace. Due to the pressure, Shah was forced to cancel the visit for the time being. Henderson himself held a meeting with Mossadegh, warning him of the detrimental effect of Shah leaving. The crowd had also made its way in front of Mossadegh's residence. A jeep was used to break down the front gate, but the crowd did not venture further. Had there been more organized activity by the crowd, the government could have been taken over. The protests were supported by a small set of French clerics, who included Ayatollah Behbahani, Ayatollah Kashani, Nazi parties Arya and Sumka, gang leaders, and members of the Retired Officers Association. He wished the ambassador to know he believed if it had not been for the actions of the ambassador, at the time the institution of monarchy would have been overthrown. The next significant attack against Mossadegh's government was the murder of Police Chief General Mahmoud Afshartus. He was first abducted on 20th April 1953. 6 days later, his body was found in a cave, hands and legs tied. Death from strangulation. Mahmoud Afshartus had gone to Khitabi's home that fateful night, lured by an offer to act as a mediator between Mossadegh and his antagonists. The attack was an attempt by the opposition to sow fear in Mossadegh's supporters by killing a strong ally, as well as weakening people's confidence in the government. His loss also left an important position open that was filled by Colonel Daftari, who facilitated the coup. Members of Retired Officers Association and devotees of Shah provided the military personnel who did the work on the ground, while Hussein Khitabi and Muzaffar Baghi were the masterminds of the operation. It is also argued that political organizations that took part in the February crisis were also implicated in Afshartus' plot and later on the coup. The overriding consideration is that the whole question of compensation must be left to the impartial arbitration of an international tribunal. Furthermore, terms of any future agreements must be such as not to appear to provide a reward for tearing up of contractual obligations or to disturb pattern of world oil prices.
One blind date in 1953 involved the overthrow of the premier of Iran. The CIA was clearly involved.
The government of Mossadegh, if you recall history, was overthrown by the action of the Shah. Now that we encouraged the Shah to take that action, I will not deny.
In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government.
The final version of the operation implemented was called TPAJAX. As there was no British presence in Iran after the closure of the embassy, a collaboration with the Americans was needed. On 4th of April 1953, a budget of $1 million was allocated to the operation. The British contributed financially as well. Without an accurate cost breakdown, It is hard to find how all the money was spent, but roughly it was spent on propaganda, operative salaries, bribes to majlis, civilians, thugs, and religious clerics. Dr. Donald Wilber, a consultant for Near East Asia branch of the CIA, and Norman Matthew Derbyshire had several meetings throughout May 1953 in order to determine the political situation in Iran. The history from the British side of the operation is difficult to know due to limited declassified documents, hence the lack of information on Derbyshire. Derbyshire headed the SIS Iran branch, was fluent in Farsi as he had spent time in Iran. Wilber was supposed to be an academic of Middle East, specifically archaeology and art history, which allowed him to travel the world while working for the agency. His specialty in the spy business was psychological warfare. After finding common ground on the situation, they began discussing of the resources that would be used in this operation. It was the aim of this project to use Shah and Zahedi in order to remove Mossadegh. Zahedi was abducted and sent to Palestine for having contacts with the Germans during World War II. Zahedi, however, possessed the qualities they were looking for. Zahedi, unscrupulous, energetic, and ambitious, has a rare quality of interest in practical problems and how to deal with them. He is an opportunist and as such would seek a settlement of the oil controversy on realistic basis. Even after the removal of the British embassy, they still possessed assets that could be used. Most prominent was the Rashidian family. Habibullah Rashidian had 3 sons, Asadullah, Saifullah, and Qudratullah, eldest to youngest. Habibullah was employed as a servant of the British embassy and later became a point of contact between British embassy and Sayyid Zia. Habibullah later benefited financially by supplying the British embassy with goods during the Second World War. Sayyid Zia played an influential role in the life of Rashidian brothers. They engaged in funneling British money into Sayyid Zia's National Will Party and others through an import business selling British movies. Asadullah believed that the problem of oil could be solved by Sayyid Zia. Ideologically, Asadullah was closely aligned with the British, believing that they were cause of progress in the countries they occupied. Hence, the welfare of Iran was tied to the British as well. Asadullah was also a loyal supporter of Reza Shah. Shah trusted him enough to discuss matters of the country with him. Further, having historic ties with the British, Rashidians were able to play a pivotal role in the coup. Rashidians were connected with all layers of Tehran society, including reporters, majlis, military, and members of royal family and clergy. But most significant was the power they wielded among Tehran Bazaar guilds and southern Tehran thugs. Asadullah Rashidian had a relationship of mutual reciprocity with a wide array of people, serving as an intermediary. After the coup, Rashidians continued to hold open house, where they met with people of all classes. On one day of the week, they would invite downtrodden people in order to hear their problems and try to solve them, such as help finding a job, greasing the wheels of bureaucracy, helping get a family member out of prison, and etc. Asadullah maintained relationship with the leaders of southern Tehran thugs that had mobilized people on the day of the coup. Members of the Zorkhanes were also connected to Rashidians. Zorkhane is a traditional athletic sport, but at least they have put us in touch with 2 men whom they think could be of great use. They are known under the pseudonym as Nozi and Kafron, and I shan't identify them further. CIA's assets consisted of Ali Jalali and Farooq Gevani. There is, however, some history involved as to how they became involved with the CIA. They are brothers whom we refer to as the Boscos. In order to combat the Tudeh party and Soviet influence, U.S. had established a propaganda project under the name of TPAJAX. In 1952 to 1953, $1 million was spent on the operation, where $600,000 went to Jalali and Kevani, offering to use their network of journalists, politicians, and contacts in the bazaar. Jalali and Kevani approached the U.S. Embassy, hoping to conduct anti-communist activities. They were able to meet Roosevelt, who took them to U.S. in order to assess and train them further. They were found to have knowledge of clandestine activity. Jalali had studied law, but worked as an editor of a newspaper. He met Kevani while they worked at Itlaat Daily. His good English allowed him to form connections with American newspapers, such as Daily Telegraph and Associated Press. Their activities for the CIA consisted of funneling money to anti-communist newspapers and right-wing organizations such as Somka, Pan-Iranist, and Toilers Party. These organizations were known to attack two-day rallies. Black demonstrations were held by Jalali and Kevani, where poor people had been paid to pretend to be two-day and act violently in order to disgrace the real two-day. The Tehran chief of station suggested that an alternative plan to provide for the overthrow of Mosaddeq be developed. This was to become the Amini-Kashaki plan, which the station kept alive as a possible alternative until the successful conclusion of TPAJAX. What Wilber is referring to here is using the stay-behind capabilities developed in Iran after World War II. The stay-behind operation was a resistance force U.S. developed in order to counter potential Soviet invasion of Iran. They made maps of strategic areas, hid cash, gold, and weapons among Kashaki tribes in order to create a fighting force. CIA could encourage and assist tribal groups to maintain control within their zones. Mr. Waller reported that CIA had stockpiled enough arms and demolition material to support a 10,000-man guerrilla organization for 6 months, and has entered into a tentative agreement with certain tribal elements in the south of Iran to establish safe haven bases. From 9 to 14 of June, a series of meetings were held with the major actors present in Beirut. There, the plan was finalized. By 11 July 1953, the plan had been approved by the President, Director of CIA, and the British. Asadullah visited Princess Ashraf, Shah's sister, in Paris Riviera in order to prepare her for the visit by Derbyshire and Stephen Meade. At first she refused, but later agreed to deliver to the Shah news that plan to remove Mosaddeq was now in action. She arrived in Tehran on 25th of July. To fulfill his role as a field commander, Kermit Roosevelt sneaked through Iraq towards Tehran. Wilber was in charge of psychological warfare, while George Carroll had traveled from Korea and reached Tehran by 21 July in order to work out the military strategy. To avoid answering for his involvement in Afshatos case, Zahidi found refuge in Majlis building under the political protection of Kashani. During that time, he communicated with the CIA through his son, Ardashir Zahidi, until he was able to seek shelter elsewhere and communicate directly. Having Shah on board was essential to the plan, as he was to provide the quasi-legal justification to undertake the coup and motivate the army to act in the name of the throne. When Princess Ashraf arrived in Iran, she was not received well by either the Shah or Mossadegh and his supporters. After she presented the Shah with a letter regarding visit of a General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., they were able to have a successful meeting. After completing her task, she was out of the country. Asadullah Rashidian represented UK in an official capacity to the Shah. Asadullah had been able to counsel the Shah that the visit by Schwarzkopf represented a joint US and UK commitment. To further assure Shah that a plan had come from higher up, Derbyshire made sure a phrase was presented on BBC radio. Roosevelt described the trick as, instead of saying it is now midnight, the announcer will say it is now exactly midnight. A war of nerves continued against Mossadegh through official and secret means. Asadullah had been given propaganda material to be published against Mossadegh, while the U.S. officials started to give Mossadegh a cold shoulder. In a press conference by Alan Dulles that highlighted the growing activity of illegal communist activity in Iran, provided a platform for the propaganda activities. In order to make people believe further that communists were a threat, activities such as threatening calls to religious leaders, fake bombings, and smell bombings were done in the name of Today. Schwarzkopf had been sent to get the Shah to sign on two documents, one to appoint Zahidi as chief of staff, and other to call the dissolution of Majlis illegal. He arrived on 1st of August under a diplomatic mission, visiting a few countries until he arrived in Tehran. Shah flat out refused to sign anything. He doubted the loyalty of his military and wished to have members of the cabinet be approved by him. The dissolution of the Majlis by Mosaddeq is a controversial point in the study of the events. Due to the obstructions posed by the Majlis, Mossadegh appealed to the public on 27 July through a radio broadcast arguing for a referendum to dissolve Majlis. The conditions of the Majlis had become hostile to Mossadegh and the project of oil nationalization, in part due to CIA spending $11,000 per week since May to buy Majlis members. The opposition made every attempt to stop the Majlis from reaching quorum, such as inflammatory and hostile comments, willful legal obstruction, refusing to be present during sessions, and even physical fighting. By an overwhelming majority, the referendum vote passed. CIA, however, made sure to relentlessly pursue this point. In their propaganda, even comparisons to Hitler were made. Mossadegh was now a power-hungry dictator. This stands in contrast to earlier National Front and two-day rallies that drew a crowd of more than 50,000 supporting the referendum. In private, U.S. admitted, while opposition continues to display courageous facade, it appears incapable combating Mossadegh in showdown struggle. It furthermore lacks leadership, while Shah continues docile in hands prime minister. The CIA, now seeing the resistance from Shah, decided to ask him to sign on two documents, or royal orders known as Farman, one to remove Mossadegh from his position, while other to transfer control to General Zahidi. In their earlier planning, CIA had decided to rely on the 3rd Mountain Brigade and did not possess any military assets beyond that. A force was needed in the case that Mossadegh disobeyed Shah's Farman. Colonel Abbas Farzanagan was brought to the U.S., given a lie detector test, and received his training while hidden in Washington. His primary task was to re-establish his old military contacts. A major wrench was thrown into the plan. When upon reading General Zahidi's list of military assets, they found that he controlled none of the 5 army brigades. Instead, he had placed high hopes on members of the Department of Army Transportation, Imperial Guard, Police and Armed Custom Guard. Without a list of military personnel willing to engage in the coup for the Shah, he was unlikely to sign anything. Farzanagan was friends with Major General Nader Batmanglich and Colonel Hassan Akhoui, who would help build a new CIA organization through their contacts in the military. While working at the Counterintelligence Office, Akhoui had gathered knowledge regarding personal details of military officers, including their political appetites. It was due to suspicion that he was transferred to the Department of Army Transportation. In July 1953, Akhoui moved Colonel Mohsen Mobassar into the lead position of Inspectorate Office of the Army's Counterintelligence Office that allowed access to secretive information. Akhoui was tasked with making a military plan. Even though his plans were not satisfactory for the CIA team, it led them to the discovery of Zand Karimi. The contacts of Zand Karimi were important as they included officers who could command action, i.e. commanders and deputy commanders. By 13 August, CIA had recruited about 40 officers into a fighting force. Even after receiving the list of military officers participating in the action by both Akhoui and Rashidian, Shah was still not willing to sign the Farmans, even though he had been willing to work against Mossadegh behind the scene. He was unwilling to take a risk where his position might be discovered. However, he was also under pressure to participate. Through Asadullah, Roosevelt delivered this message: would leave in complete disgust unless the Shah took action within a few days. Shah had a vacation home in Caspian Sea at Ramsar, where he planned to stay after signing the documents and having a final meeting with Zahidi. In the end, papers were not ready before Shah departed, so he met Zahidi and went away. Colonel Nematullah Nasiri, commander of Imperial Custom Guard, went to Ramsar to get the Farmans. In actuality, Nasiri brought with himself 2 official blank letterheads with Shah's signatures. The content was composed by someone else. Shah's palace staff and Asadullah are credited with the creation of the final documents. Late last night, accompanied by kisses, literally from Iranian source, we informed, papers brought by. They're now in possession, Zahidi. Evidently pressure finally effective, and we feel much credit must go to action scheduled midnight tonight. Officers that Zand Karimi had convinced to join the plot assembled at Tehran's boat club. Colonel Khosrow Panna of the 2nd Mountain Brigade arrived there and allocated everyone their duties. General Zahidi, who had been evading arrest, attended a meeting at Khashani's house. To formulate the remaining aspects of the plan, Farzanigan and Batmanklich were also in attendance. Imperial Guard Commander Colonel Nasiri first went to Sadabad garrison. To his companions he mentioned that Shah had dismissed Mosaddeq because under him Tudeh influence was rising. Part of the army was controlled by Tudeh as well. The royal edict was read out. When Nasiri arrived at Bageshah garrison with his companions, he delivered a similar message. Mossaddeq's residence was situated in close proximity to Bageshah garrison, making it an important part of the plan. A final plan was discussed, and it was decided that Lieutenant Askari would accompany Nasiri to Mossaddeq's house. There are 2 possible sources of how Mossaddeq came to know of the plot. In a telegram it is said that Taghi Reahi, Chief of Staff, knew of the plot 6 hours beforehand. Another explanation is that members of Tudeh's military organization were able to forward that information through a liaison to Mossaddeq. This allowed Mossaddeq to mount a defense at strategic points. Hussein Fatmi was Minister of Foreign Affairs and lived near Sadabad. When soldiers from Sadabad garrison arrived at Hussein Fatmi's house, he had just returned from a party and was getting ready for the night. Attackers were members of the Imperial Guard. Pointing guns at him and his family, Fatmi was forcefully taken to Sadabad garrison. The same team broke into a house in northern Tehran. Pro-Mossaddeq associates were then arrested and sent to Sadabad garrison, but they were unable to find Reahi, who left for his office at 11 p.m. The arrest of key Mossaddeq individuals had been approved in advance. As soldiers were departing on their assignments, a guest arrived. Imperial Guards had a reputation of being enthusiastically pro-Shah. It was likely that a coup might have started there. Perhaps this is why Kiani was sent to the Bageshah garrison by Reahi, who was in his office at the time. Even though Kiani was his superior, Nasiri ordered his arrest. Then he left for his target. Captain Bilari commanded a force deployed to help Nasiri. On the other side, Asmude, the commander of Pahlavi Regiment, started heading from Bageshah garrison to telephone center in Tehran Bazaar. By taking over the telephone exchange in Tehran Bazaar, communication between government buildings could be severed. Asmude was tasked with this mission. Moving from Bageshah garrison, he reached there at 12. By force, Asmude took over the exchange center. To cause a temporary outage, he removed the fuse. Next, his goal was to assist Nasiri at Mossaddeq's residence. Zand Karimi was given a similar mission of disabling telephone station located at Ekbatan. From there, he was to also assist Nasiri. In hopes of making an arrest, Nasiri arrived at Mossaddeq's house and handed him the Farman. Colonel Momtaz then apprehended Nasiri. General Batmanklich also decided to abandon his task of taking over Reahi's headquarters after seeing that it was being defended by tanks. The news of Nasiri's arrest led to loss of morale, as officers who were supposed to rally at Mossaddeq's residence went back to their barracks. The telephone center resumed function at 2 a.m. when Asmude returned and installed a new fuse. American embassy staff were quick to action when Farzanigan approached and told them what had happened. He was quickly hidden. At the same time, Mossaddeq was informed by his Air Force commander, General Mehdi, that Shah and Queen Soraya had left in a hurry via a plane. The events of the failed coup were announced through the radio. After the coup, the mood was as if a storm had passed. But for some, including Mossaddeq, unease still lingered. The coup forces were able to move without being stopped or questioned, right up to the point of success. Many of the security forces that had the responsibility to maintain a martial law had willingly overlooked or assumed a neutral position. The CIA station were anxious by the fact that telephone communication was still functional, proving that things did not go to plan. After finding out the location of Ardashir Zahidi, Roosevelt went to Shimron. There he discovered that both father and son believed that things could be turned around. The day continued with the discussion of what future would hold as people hurled around radios in streets and cafes. Coup makers found that certain events helped their cause. When the dissolution of Majlis as well as Shah's departure were announced, a sense of political confusion was present. Significance placed here upon fact, Shojat, principal two-day newspaper, only one to have account alleged coup d'etat this morning, and that same paper had proclaimed imminence coup since August 13.
Actually, the Shah had tried to fire Premier Mohammad Mossadegh and had failed. With the help of CIA and British operatives, though, he was finally ousted. Mossadegh's crimes had been his nationalization of the great pool of Persian oil and his flirtation with the Russians. When it was all over, the West had held on to the oil and Mossadegh had only his famous tears.